Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. So we're going to be covering why the Mishnahs are dealing with fig trees. What's going on with the fig tree that makes the fig tree different from other trees? So the Mishnah stated whether a non-fruit tree, etc., and we're going to view it as if it was a fig tree for means of production. And the Gemara explains why fig trees are picked in the Mishnah. And the Gemara asks and says, and why did they say that fig trees are the standard? And it's because the fruit is large and they produce many fruits. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky says about this that he gave a Beur shiurim series, and so in his series of commentary on the Yerushalmi, here's what he says about the fig trees about this Gemara. He says, since a fig tree's fruits are large and numerous, there are considerable differences between the yield of a small fig tree and that of a larger one. Consequently, it's easy to tell what size of fig tree would produce the required yield, and that size may be used to determine whether another type of tree is large enough. So the idea is that the smaller fig tree is not going to produce bigger fruit. It's going to produce smaller fruit. And so they're looking at the fig tree because they know that a fig tree of a certain size is going to produce certain sized fruit. That's the idea and explanation by Rabbi Kanievsky. And this is why the Mishnah decided to standardize it, because you'll be able to tell basically that this is coming from a smaller tree, that this fruit is from a smaller tree that will never make this required yield. And you can't get confused because it's not going to produce figs that are the same size as a large tree that will fill this halachic requirement. That's the idea. Now the Gemara is going to explain why other species of trees do not satisfy these two particular conditions. What are the conditions? One is that the fruit is going to be large, and two, it's going to produce many fruit. And the Gemara is going to say, well, there's the etrog tree, but it was not chosen as a standard because even though the fruit is large, it does not produce many. I have an etrog tree that's happily living outside of our house, and in the past year, I only saw it produce one etrog, so that would not be like a fig tree. Then the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, there is the olive tree, but it too was not chosen as a standard. Although it produces many fruits, its fruits are not large. And the Gemara continues and says, however, these fig trees produce many fruits and their fruits are large. Now, the Gemara is going to give a different explanation as to why fig trees are chosen as the standard. And this is a really deep idea here. So, Rabbi Chia bar Ada says, all other trees may be productive one year and unproductive the next year, whereas this fig tree is productive every year. In other words, what this Gemara is saying is that it's going to be this reason that the fig tree is easy to measure, because it's going to be producing pretty consistently every year. Sometimes you'll end up with an olive tree that will produce a lot in 1 year, and then it just won't produce much the next year, and then the year after it'll produce a lot. And the fig tree is different because it'll produce a real lot, and it'll be producing it consistently. And that's one of the reasons why they standardized it. Also, keep in mind the fig tree is a little bit different than other trees. The fig trees and olive trees, both, the Gemara says, have more branches than normal trees. And when you sit in Eretz Yisrael and you look at a fig tree or you look at an olive tree, you'll see that's true. It really does have more branches than a regular tree. And so it's interesting that the fig tree also is going to have a consistent yield year after year, which is going to be this other reason why the fig tree is chosen. And it's going to be easier to determine the yield, and that's going to help you to figure out whether you have a field of trees or your field of trees is not a field of trees and it's going to be counted as a field of grain. Now, the next part of the Mishnah is saying that if one's tree produces a 60 manna block of figs and two do not produce it, one may plow for them one may not plow for them any more than their need. So, just to remind you, this law is between 3 and 9 trees. 10 trees is a magic number because you plant them 2 rows of 5, and it counts as a field of trees automatically when you space them out like that on a betseya. But what about trees 3 through 9? So the Mishnah is trying to teach that the entire field may not be plowed unless every one of the trees produces. Now, we mentioned in the Mishnah there's a disagreement between the Ravad and the Rosh about this. Both have very, very valid readings on this. And you could read all of this with either reading, and it really makes a lot of sense. It's a maloket, and you have to check the halacha l'maisa on it. But the idea, the Mishnah is teaching that the entire field may not be plowed unless every one of the trees is productive. Now, Gemara is going to try to explain how much the tree will produce, and I'm going to read this at first like how the Ravad would be explaining it, and then I will give you an explanation on how the other view would be explaining it. So, Rabbi Bivi says in the name of Rabbi Hanina, one may plow a field of 3 trees provided that he does not have any tree producing less than a third of the required yield of 60 manna. Similarly, Zera bar Hanina said, one may plow a field of 9 trees provided that he does not have any tree producing less than a ninth of the required yield of 60 manna. Now that is pointing out that, when the Mishnah said that the tree does not produce, it meant that the tree produced less than the proportionate share of the 60 manna required for the entire field. Now, if this were to be read by the Rosh's interpretation of it, then you would say that each of the trees has to be producing 60 manna. And then if one of the trees produced less than that, then it would not be counting as a field of trees. That's going to be the idea. But the Ravad's point would be that if you had 9 there, you have to produce for the 9 trees 60 manna, and that means that 1/9, each tree has to produce 1/9. And if one tree produces less than a ninth, then you have a problem. So again, the Ravad's pointing out that you have to have a 60 manna total for the trees. It has to all add up to 60 manna. And then you're going to divide it by the number of trees you have. And each tree has to have its own proportionate share of the 60 manna. And the problem comes when you have a tree that falls under that proportionate share. Then you got a problem. Now, that is pointing out that, hey, you have a real incentive economically to make sure you're planting 3 trees or 10 trees, because if you're planting 3 trees, you're going to have a greater likelihood that the tree's root system is fully utilizing the nutrition. And once you start to overcrowd the field, you're going to have overlap with the roots, and then you might have a problem where the trees are not pulling enough nutrition to produce this yield. So really, there's going to be a logic for why you just want either 3 or 10. You don't want to go to a weird number like 6, because all the overlap, you're going to end up potentially diminishing for each tree. You might not, but you definitely might. And it looks like there's an economic incentive to keep it at 3 or 6. 3 because you maximize the root system's nutrition. So in the other view, in the Rosh's view, okay, you're going to have where each of the trees has to produce each of the trees has to produce by itself 60 manna. Now that certainly, if you're overcrowding the root system with 2 extra trees, and those 2 extra trees, according to the Rosh's view of it, you've collapsed your yield, and now you don't have a field of trees anymore. You have a field of grain, and it limits how you can plow. So, if you were going to look at it according to the Rosh's interpretation on this Gemara, the idea would be that it would be where the production of a third or a ninth would suffice, and that would refer to where the Mishnah's next case would be where 10 or more trees are present. And so, according to Rabbi Bivi, each has to produce a third of 60 manna, and according to to Zera, it's enough that it produces a ninth of 60 manna. And the Vilna Goan gives his own explanation about this, but in continuing, we understand that 3 or more trees is going to be filling the requirement of an orchard. But we covered this in Halacha 1, that there has to be enough space between the trees to allow the cattle and the plow to pass between to plow it. In other words, we're talking about working farms. We're not talking about hobby farms. We're not talking about 2 retirees doing it just for fun. We're talking about a real working farm where you're actually thinking out the maximization of root yield and roots and nutrition yield, and you're not just like a hobbyist farmer. And part of that means that you have to have cattle and a plow being pulled to pass through the trees, because the idea, if you're going to be plowing up until Shavuot, the idea of the plowing is going to be to strengthen the tree and strengthen the fruit for this year's crop. And so how can you do that if you didn't plant them far enough to get that water into the soil, into that root system? The trees have to be spaced enough where the plow can go by. Now, we covered that before. That distance is going to be 4 amot, minimum 4 amot. And the Gemara is going to talk about cases where the distance between some of the trees is going to be 4 amot, but some are not. What's going to happen? So the Gemara says if there are 4 amot if there are 4 trees between which a team of cattle with its plowing implements can pass, and there are 2 other trees between them where the cattle and its plowing tools cannot pass, the law is as follows. Since a team of cattle with its plowing implements cannot pass between the last 2 trees, you view them, that's going to be all of the trees in the field, as if there are only 5. Why would that be? Well, so we started off, we mentioned that there were 6 trees in here, okay, and now they're too close. 2 of them are too close, right? So it's holding that there's 6 trees in the Betseya. 2 of them are too close to allow the passage of cattle. And the idea is that the 2 trees that are too close are going to be regarded as a single tree because it has to be uprooted. And if, you only have, it's basically saying that you only really just have 5 trees in the Betseya, because it means that in that 5 you have proper spacing where the plow and the cattle can pass through it. And if you didn't have the 2 trees together, that 1 tree that's too close where the cattle can't get through it to plow it, it's going to count as 1 tree, and basically instead of looking at it in terms of you having 6 trees, it's like you really have 5 trees, because one of them, the one too close, has to be uprooted. And if you had 4 properly spaced trees, and then you had a 5th one, then you would have where that 5th one would be combined together with one of the 4, And it's really like you have 4 trees because that 5th one would have to be uprooted. That's going to be the idea. Now, I want to explain this according to the Rosh. So the Rosh is saying that you have to have 60 manna for each tree. And the point of this Gemara would be that if you had 2 combined trees, they would need to produce 60 manna between them. Why would that be? Because they're too close, the root system's too close, and the yield is going to drop. And the idea, if you're looking at it in the Rosh, it's saying that, no, it's like you have 1 tree. Okay? Now, if you want to look at it by the Ravad, that would be that each tree needs to produce a proportionate share of 60 manna required for the field. And so if you're going to look at it like that, like you had 6, well, and one, the cow couldn't go through with the plow, you're really looking at it as if it's like 5 trees, not 6 trees, because the yield of that 6th one is going to be combined in the 5th tree. That's going to be the idea if you're going to read it by the Ravad, or if you're going to read it by the Rosh. Both are very valid readings of it, and both make a lot of sense. However, both are basically saying that this extra tree that can't fit the plow between it is going to be combined with the other trees. So again, if you had that extra tree, that oddball tree, and there were 6 trees planted there, and one of them is too close where it can't get a plow through it with the cattle, then it's really like you have 5 trees for your calculation, not 6. That's the idea. Now the Gemara is going to move on to a vineyard, and that's important because vineyards have a special rule. All of the grapes and vines and vineyards have to be treated according to Jewish law. Otherwise, the wine that's produced, you can't use it in the Bet HaMikdash. You're not allowed to use it for service. It is pasul. So what happens with vineyards? What's the case about, and by the way, all of the vineyards before the Bet HaMikdash comes needs to be checked, because I'm sure that the spacing is not going to be properly done on a lot of them. The Gemara is going to give a solution on how to deal with a vineyard that is in Eretz Yisrael that's not spaced properly. So the Gemara is talking about this related case. If there are 5 trees and a gap between each tree and its neighbor tree is less than the 4 amos required for the passage of cattle with its plowing tools, the law depends on a dispute between Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the rabbis. The Gemara continues and says, and we have learned in a Mishnah elsewhere, if a vineyard is planted with less than 4 amos between the rows, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says it is not a vineyard because the vines are planted too close together. So what does that mean that it's not a vineyard? Well, you could say that it's just a collection of independent vines. And when you plant foreign seeds there, you have to have a distance of only 6 tefachim. And that would be from any one vine. Now, if it were a yekev, which is a vineyard, then the distance, the minimum distance between foreign seeds is going to be 4 amo. Okay? So there's that one difference. And another difference is going to be that if it's like a collection of vines and it's not really a working thing, where you could pass the plow and the cattle through between the vines, then what happens is it limits on when you can work the field. In other words, if you're on the 6th year, you can work and it's not spaced properly, you can work that area like a grain field. You're not allowed to work it like a field of trees. That's the point. Now, the sages have a different view. And the sages say it is considered a vineyard, and we view the interior ones as if they are not there. In other words, what they're doing is, let's say you have 5 rows. They're basically going to disregard the ones that are too close. So you would disregard that, let's say the 4th one is too close to the 5th one. Then you basically would disregard the 4th one. And this dispute is totally related to this case because when you have 5 trees that are planted on a bet seah and each is within 4 amos of the neighbor, according to Shimon Bar Yochai, these trees are not properly distanced from one another, and they do not comprise a field of trees. Now, according to the sages, they're viewing every other tree as if it's going to be a tree, but it has to be removed. In other words, they're holding that the extra trees have to be plucked out of the ground. And so they're saying that, no, it is a vineyard. You just didn't plant it right. You have to uproot all of this stuff. You have to pull it out. It's still a vineyard, but you're not allowed to hold it like this. You have to uproot it. So when the Mashiach comes and the Sanhedrin's restored, there's going to be a time when people have to go out and look at the vineyards. And if the vines are too close, they're going to have to uproot vines in the modern vineyards you have today to make sure that there's a distance of 4 amos between the vines. Also, they're going to have to check for kalayim, make sure it's not being grown next to any foreign species. That's going to be another problem, because if that's the case where it's next to kalayim, you're not allowed to have any benefit from it, and you have to burn it. You have to burn the stuff. So very serious if there's kalayim in the land. Now the Mishnah said that if there are 10 or more trees, then whether they produce or they don't, in other words, it doesn't matter if they produce 60 manna at this point. It's going to be fully utilized. And the Gemara says that we may plow the entire Betsei on their account. And the Gemara says that this is, as it is stated, from the plowing and from the reaping you shall desist. So the idea is that if you have 10 trees, then you're going to be in a good spot, because you could just plow it. You don't have to sit and worry about the 60 manna yield. So there is an economic incentive to plant according to 2 rows of 5 to fully utilize the land. And you might also say that, hey, there's a mitzvah to settle the land, and look, I'm fully utilizing this piece of land according to halacha, and so you could see that as also kind of being consistent with settling the land versus another arrangement that, yes, it does maximize the tree, but not all of the land is utilized in that Betseya. Now, about this, we're getting into this disagreement between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And this Mishnah did not cite the verse in order to support the law that just came about the trees. And the verse is prohibiting plowing where the law before is going to permit it. And the Gemara is really trying to teach a different part of the Mishnah. And we're going to get into the Omer. Really, it's going to be trying to deal with the Omer. And the Gemara says that this verse is cited only in reference to the first part of the Mishnah, which concluded that if the trees yield less than the required amount, one may not plow for them any more than their need. And regarding this prohibition, the Mishnah cites support from Scripture that this is stated, from the plowing and from the reaping you must desist. You shall desist, says the Torah. So Rabbi Kanievsky says about this the following. It says that the verse does not pertain to a specific prohibition of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah speaks of the prohibition that begins at Pesach or Shavuot, which is merely rabbinic. Rather, the verse is cited to show that the general pre-Sheviis prohibition has a biblical source, and in particular, though the prohibition is biblical only during the last 30 days before Sheviis, and the rabbis advanced the day it takes effect to Pesach or Shavuot. Alternatively, the sugya could be holding that the biblical prohibition begins at Pesach or Shavuot. That's another way to read it. So the verse would be teaching that one may not plow in the 6th year in preparation of the 7th year, and therefore if the trees produce that required amount, in which case they constitute a field of trees, then plowing the entire field is regarded as supporting them in the 6th year, and one may plow the entire field until Shavuot. But after Shavuot, when plowing will be harming the trees, it would be done to prepare the ground for the 7th year, and that is not going to be allowed. So if the trees would fail to produce that required amount, they do not comprise a field of trees. They comprise a field of grain. Basically, it's going to have the halacha of grain. And the plowing on that account is going to be prohibited as early as Pesach. So that's going to be the idea. Now, the Gemara is going to quote from this Mishnah, and it's going to say there's no need for the verse to say. That's the part of the Mishnah we're talking about. And the Mishnah is going to cite Rabbi Yishmael's opinion that the reaping of barley for the Omer is going to override the Shabbos restrictions. And the Gemara is going to comment, and Rabbi Yishmael is consistent with his opinion elsewhere. For Rabbi Yishmael said, the barley for the Omer does not come from Syria. Rather, it must be reaped from the produce of Eretz Yisrael. Real quick, there was King David went, and not everybody was behind the conquest, but King David went and conquered Syria. And there's a debate among the Tanaim whether Syria is going to count as Eretz Yisrael or not, whether under biblical law it's going to be part of Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Yishmael is pointing out that you're not allowed to bring the Omer from Syria. Well, the Omer has to come from Eretz Yisrael, so obviously he's taking the position that it was a personal conquest, not a national conquest. So therefore, you don't bring the Omer from outside Eretz Yisrael, and you don't bring it from Syria. So that this requirement will also apply even on Sheviis when you would when reaping in Sheviis in Eretz Yisrael is not allowed. And the idea is that Rabbi Yishmael is holding that the mitzvah of reaping the Omer stalks overrides the Sheviis prohibition. So, you're not allowed to reap on Shabbos, and you're also not allowed to reap in Eretz Yisrael on the 7th year. But what they're pointing out is that the Omer is going to override that because that's a positive commandment, and the other is a lo ta'aseh, you shall not do, and the Omer, reaping of the Omer, is you shall do, right? So the idea is that in general, a positive commandment will outweigh a negative commandment when the two are going to be in conflict. So that's how you're going to hold that the mitzvah of reaping the Omer during the 7th year, or even on Shabbat, would override the Shabbos or the Sheviis prohibition. And the Gemara says that this is consistent with the ruling of the Mishnah, where Rabbi Yishmael said that the reaping of barley for the Omer, which is a mitzvah, is excluded from the Shabbos prohibition. Now, keep in mind that Shabbos is used for the day of the week in the Torah, and is also mentioned as a part of the 7th year for the land. It's also referred to as a Shabbos rest. So whether, says Rabbi Yishmael, whether you're going to be reaping the barley for the Omer on the 7th year or on Shabbos, reaping is going to be a mitzvah that's excluded, and you're allowed to do it on the Shabbos or the 7th year. That's going to be the idea. And that is going to conclude Chapter 1, Halacha 4 Sheviis. Halacha 3 of Sheviis. We're going to get to Halacha 4 tomorrow. And in Halacha 4, we're going to be talking more about 3 trees in a bet seah. And, this is coming up because guess what? There's a lot of farms that are not organized correctly in Eretz Yisrael. When you go to the north, you will see all of the fields that are, all of the fields except for 2 that have a Ada Haredi stamp on it for the pear trees are growing grafted pears. The bottom parts of the trees are going to be with a quince, and they grafted on top a pear in order to make it grow in the north parts of where the Goan is in the north to grow the orchards up there. And that's not permitted with Kalayim. In fact, Jewish ownership of it is such that you have to rip it up, and you're not allowed to own those trees when you're going to follow halacha. This has some strange dati lumi hechsher on it on those fields, but I don't think that a Sanhedrin would agree with that. And also, you're allowed to eat and use the pear as a Jew, as a Jewish consumer, but you're not allowed to own that field as a Jew. And growing kalayim in Eretz Yisrael is a serious problem. Now, the other issue is going to be that when you're rebuilding the Bet Hamikdash, you have to go back out and reevaluate these vineyards, because I've been to many vineyards. I'm not sure that the spacing is going to be halachically correct. Will it count like what the rabbis are saying, like what this Gemara is saying, like a vineyard? Yes. But what they're trying to point out is that, no, you have to rip it out. You have to rip out the extra vines to create that spacing. So you're not allowed to just leave it alone and produce wine for the temple. Anyway, have a great day. I want to point out these points because, this stuff is relevant for when the temple comes. And, you're learning something about, what's going to be part of the temple service. This stuff is going to be used that way. And, I want to point out another thing, that if somebody had a grafted tree with pomegranate, because you have the 7 species, has the laws for Beurim where you bring it in front of the altar. Well, if there was a grafted tree with a pomegranate, that doesn't count as a pomegranate, so you don't bring it for Beurim. So we want to know about this stuff, because the law of the land, first of all, it's in the Torah, and we want to observe all the 613 mitzvot as best as we can. And the other thing about it is that we should know about it because when we see these areas and these farms, we should make a mental note of it, because it needs to be modified for when to fit in with the land when the temple comes. Have a great day.